26th of February, 2010 marks exactly 125 years from the end of the infamous Berlin Conference. This led to the Scramble for Africa, an interesting terminology. If you'll remember, as we studied Equiano, the scramble for Africans who would then soon become slaves was called a scramble. The soon-to-be slave owners would rush into an enclosed area where the Africans were and grab slaves. The same word is applied to the European nations' attempt and successful colonization of Africa. Apart from slavery, both the transatlantic slave and Arab slavery, there is no single event in modern African history whose consequences have been so dire for the continent as the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885. Held over 3 months in Berlin, Germany, and attended by 13 European nations and the US, the conference set the ground rules for the partition of Africa, leading to what Mo Ibrahim now describes as the unviable states on the continent. So there was no regard for language groups, ethnic groups. Divisions were created, borders were created, and people were separated from other members of their family, from people of the same language group. Africa has not recovered to this day. At the table of the 13 European leaders and the American leader, there were no Africans at the table. I'm going to refer to Adam Hochschild a few times in the presentation. He is a writer, historian, and journalist. He wrote King Leopold's Ghost, from which the quotes come, which is an in-depth look at King Leopold. If you're interested in learning more about him, that's your best source. Adam Hochschild, King Leopold's Ghost. He also wrote Bury the Chains, which is on the British abolition movement. There's a lot about Equiano in there. For over 400 years, Africans were kidnapped and enslaved by hostile countries, England, Portugal, Spain, France, and America, and this is often referred to by European scholars as Maafa, in Swahili, the Great Disaster. So this Berlin Conference of 1884 and 1885 wasn't a singular event that caused this destruction in Africa, but it had been building up for 400 years. So the partition of Africa must not be seen as an isolated event. It was a continuation of previous European exploitation and flowed naturally from the 400 years of transatlantic slavery. Here's a map of Africa before 1884. So there were kingdoms. This is Igbo land, so the area where Equiano lived is here. The Yoruba people, so Fulani. So there were empires, there were kings. There was, as we learned, as we read the interesting narrative of the life of Equiano, there was a political setup, there were hierarchies, people were living and existing and doing just fine before Europeans went in. So the European rationale for going to Africa is we're going to help them, we're going to civilize them, and we're going to Christianize them. Really, instead of improving the Africans' lives, the motivation was improving their own lives, their own European country, and their own bank account. This is the partition of Africa. So this map represents 1885 to 1914. And you'll see this large area in here, the Belgian Congo. In the orange is the British colonies, including Kenya and Uganda, Egypt, parts of South Africa, Rhodesia from Cecil Rhodes, now called Zimbabwe. The French have huge areas in West Africa. So East Africans usually will speak English and a couple of African languages. Those from French West Africa will speak French and one or two or three other African languages. Germans are down here, German Southwest Africa, Namibia, German East Africa, Tanzania. We have the Portuguese in Angola and Mozambique, Italians, Libya, Somaliland, the Belgians, this one huge area, Spanish, a little bit in West Africa, and independent. So this is a map of Africa 1930, and we have South Africa, Rhodesia still, Angola. You see how large this area is, the Belgian Congo, French West Africa. So European countries were changing strategies, and they were familiar largely with the west coast of Africa, where they would go with their ships and get the Africans who had been kidnapped and bring them. Americans would bring them to America. They would go to various places. So instead of kidnapping Africans, they discovered that there were rich resources in Africa. And if you'll remember in Equiano's narrative, his suggestion was that Europe and America trade with Africa and use the resources that way in free trade, but the Europeans had other ideas. So to obtain these resources, they agreed together, these European countries, to partition Africa, and each European country took one or more territories in Africa for their possession, ostensibly, as I said, to enrich the lives of the Africans, but actually they're enriching their own lives. From the 15th of November 1884 to the 26th of February 1885, 13 European countries and America met in Berlin, hosted by the German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck. The African politico-geographical map is thus a permanent liability that resulted from the 3 months of ignorant, greedy acquisitiveness during a period when Europe's search for minerals and markets had become insatiable. 14 countries were there: Austria-Hungary, Belgium, Denmark, France, Germany, Great Britain, Italy, the Netherlands, Portugal, Russia, Spain, Sweden, Norway, Turkey, and the US. The major players were Portugal, France, Britain, and Germany. On November 15th, 1884, the representatives of the power of Europe assembled at a large horseshoe table overlooking the garden of Bismarck's yellow brick official residence, including counts, barons, colonels, and seated before a large map of Africa, the delegates got to work, though not a single African was seated at the table. I want to talk for a few minutes about King Leopold himself. King Leopold II liked to portray himself as a good man, an honest man, a humanitarian, but he was a monster. He was born to King Leopold I, who was chilly and distant. So we can see a lot of who he became may have come from his father and how he was raised. His mother thought he was ugly and had a big nose. So he had a cold, distant father and a mother who didn't really love him. And he responded by having frequent temper tantrums, showing no humor, and a very limited capacity for love. In fact, Queen Victoria of England, his first cousin, commented on his tendency to blurt out disagreeable things. When he reached adolescence, as the son of a king, he thought that he would be king, but he wondered what his future would be. And he dreamed, even at a young age, of acquiring an overseas colony. This would be great for him and for the country. He ascended to the throne of Belgium in 1865 at the age of 30 after the death of his father. Before that, he had married an archduchess named Marie Henriette. It was an arranged marriage conducted for diplomatic reasons, involving two people who were completely incompatible. He was dour, disagreeable, no sense of humor, and she was fun-loving and warm. They did not love each other and never would. For some weeks after the marriage, it seems they didn't have sex, and maybe they didn't know how. So Queen Victoria somehow found this out, and she and her husband, Prince Albert, who had 9 children, spoke discreetly to Marie Henriette and Leopold about the facts of life. Interesting little tidbit. The results were very positive. The young Belgians had a daughter, Louise, in 1858, a son, Leopold, in 1865, a second girl, Stephanie, in 1864, and a third, Clementine, in 1872. King Leopold II believed that only males could ascend to the throne, so his son was his most important child. However, his son died at the young age of 9, and his death was one more unhappiness in the life of King Leopold II. The Queen, Marie Henriette, spent as little time in King Leopold II's presence as possible and had her own royal court. King Leopold had a series of mistresses over the years, and it was said that he paid kind of a retainer, an annual sum, to a British whorehouse. True, we don't know, but it demonstrates his willingness to exploit the weak for personal pleasure and gain. Africa at the time was called the Dark Continent because it was unknown and unexplored, but others have applied that in a different way, that it became the Dark Continent when Europeans came and basically ransacked the entire continent. One of the explorers that we'll get to is Henry Stanley. So this just tells us the main countries, France, Portugal, and Congo, and Belgium, and how much land they had. So you see it varies from 257,000 square miles all the way to 905,000 square miles. And here we are at Henry Morton Stanley. He was a journalist and an empire builder. And in the mid-70s, he crossed the African continent from east to west. He's only the second person to do so, following the Congo River from its headwaters deep in the interior all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. A journey of 1,500 miles that opened up this vast region to Europe. Now people have seen it, they've walked through it. So he was sent to Africa by New York Herald publisher James Gordon Bennett to find another explorer, David Livingstone. Hence the line, Dr. Livingstone, I presume. He brought 190 Africans with him as he left the east coast of Africa. He was the second European to cross Africa from east to west. Stanley reported that Africa's interior was empty. I'm not sure what he meant by that. There were Africans there. There was a lot of wildlife there, a lot of plant life. So it certainly wasn't empty. Imagine a time when there were new discoveries being made, new lands being discovered. So the people who made these discoveries became pretty famous. A modern analogy might be somebody who discovers a new drug. As I'm recording this lecture, we're in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic. So the person who, or group, team of scientists that developed a drug or a vaccine will become famous. So Henry Stanley didn't discover a medical breakthrough, but he discovered the interior of Africa. In a Europe ever more tightly knit by the telegraph, the lecture circuit, and newspapers, African explorers became some of the first international celebrity figures, their fame crossing national boundaries like that of today's champion athletes, movie stars, or even scientists. So from 1879 to 1884, Stanley signed contracts with tribal chieftains that gave the king total unchecked power over much of the region. So you remember the years I said, 1879 to 1884. So King Leopold had a relationship with Henry Stanley. Henry Stanley was getting African kings to sign contracts, I'm sure not explaining it well, and I'm sure they didn't understand what they were signing away before he even actually was given this land, 1879 to 1884. Leopold named his colony Congo Free State, not free for the Congolese. In 1908, the land was rechristened the Belgian Congo. And we'll see on the next slide all the names that it has gone through. Many chiefs, as I said, had no idea what they were signing. Few had seen the written word before. Africa at this time is an oral society. Stories are passed down generation to generation by being told. The idea of a treaty of friendship between two clans was very familiar, but the idea of signing over your land to someone was inconceivable to Africans at that time. Leopold backed up his contracts with weapons. Leopold had one aim, and it wasn't to improve the lives of the Congolese, to cart as much of its natural wealth as fast as possible in order to line his own pockets and to improve his country. As you have read in King Leopold's soliloquy, rubber was one of the resources that they found, and just recently rubber had been used to make bicycle tires in Britain, and so this is what he got the Africans to cultivate and to cut. When you look at King Leopold II and place him in history, he is the third deadliest dictator in the history of the world, which is a little shocking to me because a lot of people have never even heard of King Leopold II. Some people were killed. Millions died of diseases and starvation. But all in all, and this was also referenced in Mark Twain's brilliant piece, King Leopold's Soliloquy, anywhere from 10 to 30 million Congolese died. Scholars put it in the range of 15 million. The deadliest dictator, Mao Zedong, killed 4 to 5 million, and 20 million Chinese starved. Second, Adolf Hitler, 6 million Jews were killed and 17 million others died. So King Leopold II is number 3, followed by Joseph Stalin, starved 10 million people, followed by Hideki Tojo. Not a list you want to be on. So what we're reading is King Leopold's Soliloquy by Mark Twain. You watch a PowerPoint about Mark Twain and his life. Writer, humorist, traveler, sailboat, steamboat captain, fascinating guy, wrote many short stories, well known for Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer. Wrote King Leopold's Soliloquy in 1905 because he wanted to draw attention to the atrocities that King Leopold II was committing in this country. Now, 15 years earlier, George Washington Williams had visited Congo thinking that King Leopold II was doing something wonderful there and he wanted to document it. When he got there, he was astounded and very upset at what he saw. He wrote a letter to King Leopold II, which you're also reading, and he was discredited. It was a smear campaign against him by King Leopold, so the letter was not taken seriously, and 15 more years went by until Mark Twain wrote his piece for the Congo Reform Association in 1905, and finally, and then the council that King Leopold appointed of his friends to examine what was happening, but they turned against him, and so they found that he was doing something so bad that they made the report on that. It wasn't until 1908 that he gave up the complete control of Congo, and Belgium took it over in 1909. As we talked about in the course before, a lot of the writing that we're reading, whether it's A Modest Proposal, the slave narratives that we've read, even Moliere's Tartuffe, there's a purpose for it. And a lot of the purpose is to enact change in society. And that was Mark Twain's purpose when he wrote King Leopold's Soliloquy. He wanted to see King Leopold taken out of the country so that the people could survive. That was his goal. And he contributed to that in a very significant way. Back to the Congo. The Congo River is one of, if not the biggest river in the world. It rises to 1,000 feet above sea level, descends rapidly in a 220-mile plunge down the plateau to the sea. And the power of this river, these 220 miles, have as much hydroelectric potential as all the lakes and rivers of the U.S. combined, and 1/6 of the world's hydroelectric potential. So the whole entire country of Congo easily has enough electricity powered by that one river. The picture doesn't do it justice. I would love to visit it, but you can see a little bit. That's 1,000 feet there. Picture several Niagara Falls. As I mentioned earlier, this plot of land in the center of Africa has undergone many name changes. It was the Congo Free State in 1885, the Belgian Congo when Belgium as a country took over, the Republic of Congo in 1960. When I visited Africa in the late 70s, it was called Zaire. And since 1998, it's been called the Democratic Republic of the Congo. We had a student here at Hudson County Community College from the Congo. So there's the large Democratic Republic of the Congo, then there's a small country right next to it, Republic of the Congo. And one of our students was from the Congo. What's happening in Congo today? The language is French. The population is 51 million. The area, still the same area, 905,000 square miles, which is as large as the land in the US from the Mississippi River all the way east. The annual income is $100 US. The religion, 50% Catholic, 20% Protestant, 10% Kimbangist, 10% Muslim, 10% others. Over 200 ethnic groups, and the capital is Kinshasa. Mark Twain put words in the mouth of King Leopold II in his brilliant piece, King Leopold's Soliloquy. He had been asked to write this by E.D. Morel, who was an English shipping clerk and started the Congo reform movement. Others involved in the push to have reform in the Congo were Booker T. Washington and Arthur Conan Doyle, who wrote the Sherlock Holmes mysteries. The Congo reform movement ultimately achieved success when, as I said, Leopold was forced to sell his colony to Belgium in 1908. King Leopold II died a lonely, bitter man less than a year later. And I hope you enjoy the reading of King Leopold's soliloquy and see the power of the pen. Thank you.